what is the film about, and what was most powerful about it for you, just as a viewer, not so much as an analyst and a historian, but what's most powerful about this gigantic 18 hours?
It's the testimony of 80 some odd people from North Vietnam and South Vietnam, from the United States, from all walks of life, from Marines, people in the Army, from guys who were flying bombing missions over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to the people back home in the streets and the challenges that they had in engaging with the war. Some in a very profound way, families being split up, people having to decide whether or not they should go ahead and enlist, or whether they should accept induction or flee to Canada or do something else. These stories are powerful, and I come at this from a position of utmost humility. I was born in the very early 1960s. I study the Vietnam War as a scholar. I don't have a real tangible sense of what that was like. But I think as a result of this film, it will be brought home to more and more Americans what it was like for so many to have to be a part of that Vietnam generation and experience a war that changed lives profoundly, whether they were the men who were fighting the war, or the women who went over there to support, or the families back home, or the kids who were in college, and the choices that they had to make. It's just an extraordinarily powerful experience.
In terms of the White House tapes, these recordings that were being made, unbeknownst to most of the people in the room at the time, these Oval Office recordings from the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration even more significantly, right, and then Nixon famously in so many ways. But how was it that the opening up of that material changed our understanding of Vietnam?
I think for so many, and this will come through in the film, there's a real disparity between the public optimism of so many officials, and particularly the presidents, and their private pessimism. And I think that's particularly the case with LBJ and Richard Nixon. It's there with Kennedy, although I would say that there's a little bit more consistency between the doubts that he expresses internally and those he expresses publicly, particularly in a noteworthy interview with Walter Cronkite in early September 1963. But it's that gap between what the public was being told and what the policymakers were thinking and wondering about the war, wondering about the strategy that they had hit upon, wondering about their capacity to win this war. I think that's what's really arresting.
In the end, your read on this whole series, does it conclude whether Vietnam was an immoral war or one that in some fashion can be justified?
I think the virtue of the series, one of the many virtues of the series, is that it's giving people a fair amount to work with to try to grapple with those questions themselves. I don't think that they wanted to be really didactic filmmakers and to pronounce on the war. But I think that what they're trying to do is to open up that conversation that we can then have and continue to wrestle with.
And hopefully maybe a conversation that as we have it, it will help us with the ones that we face now, and that young people who know nothing about, who seem to know absolutely nothing about this conflict, maybe will learn, will draw some of that wisdom from it.
It's a ground-eye view of the war by the people who fought it on both sides. And while it's an opportunity, I think, for so many in that generation to hear each other's stories, for the country to hear their stories, to get a better sense of who they were and the challenges that they faced, I really do hope that these are stories and this is an episode that a younger generation can hear about. My sense from teaching is that it's just not a period of history that the younger generation has access to. And I'm hoping that this film gives them an opportunity to dip in a little bit.
And let's take some questions from all of you once we get the lights up. And I think we have somebody who's going to help with the microphone. Yes, so, and when the microphone comes to you, they're tracking it down, if you can, stand and let the person who I haven't met yet, who's going to be holding the microphone, let her hold on to it while you talk to the microphone, so then she can move on to the next person. And while we start with Lee Middleditch there, just the second row to the back, right there, and then we'll move around.
Mark, did the film try to address the Tonkin Gulf incident in any way?
Does it address it? Absolutely. It spans a fair amount of time.
Tell us briefly what that was.
So in August of 1964, there was a naval engagement in the Tonkin Gulf off the coast of North Vietnam, in which North Vietnamese torpedo boats shot at American destroyers that were conducting intelligence gathering missions off the coast of North Vietnam. Now, these missions had been authorized earlier in 1964 and had been taking place throughout the course of the year, but in very late July, there were sabotage missions going along with the intelligence gathering missions, and a couple of islands off the coast of North Vietnam were shot up. And when the USS Maddox reappeared in the waters on August 2nd, these boats came out and fired on them. American planes shot at the oncoming Vietnamese ships and left one dead in the water, I believe, and word goes back to the Johnson White House that this has happened. Johnson is about to go into the Democratic National Convention at the end of the month. He certainly doesn't want to appear the warmonger. Barry Goldwater can have that. And so he's reluctant to do much about it, but he's hearing from a variety of people, friendly Republicans as well as from Bob McNamara, you know, we really should take some kind of action if something like this happens again. And they even take some steps to prepare what that action might be. And there's always been a question as to whether or not not only the Maddox, but the Sea Turner Joy were sent back into the Tonkin Gulf in order to create a pretext to give Johnson broader authorization to wage the war that he saw fit. Because in June of 1964, a couple months before that, a resolution had been drafted by Bill Bundy that at the appropriate time and after the Civil Rights Act of '64 had finally been passed, to roll this out to Congress, have them sign on the dotted line, and give Johnson a blank check authorization for conducting the war. So it has become, and I think the film describes this as one of the most significant moments in the 20th century, in American history. It's pretty, I wouldn't say hyperbolic language, but it's pretty dramatic language. And it's at this moment that Johnson does get that authorization through the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, giving the commander-in-chief the wherewithal to deploy American military force as he sees fit to defend American interests, because that's what ostensibly was attacked there. And it's, you know, defending American interests, even though a couple of years ago, you know, the idea would have been we're simply helping the Vietnamese. By now, the United States had escalated to such a point that American assets are all over South, as well as, in this case, North Vietnam. There were South Vietnamese commandos who were engaging in these raids, but they were being ferried up by CIA assets. So yes, it does engage that. It uses the White House tapes. You do get a sense that this was a moment where Johnson was less than candid with the American people. Bob McNamara was certainly less than candid with the American people. While the first attack from the North Vietnamese on the 2nd did occur, the alleged attack of August 4th did not occur, but there was sufficient evidence coming in to warrant, in Johnson and McNamara's view, the dispatch of 64 sorties on North Vietnam that night, August 4th. There were hearings conducted later on, and by now we know that the second attack really, it didn't occur. It just didn't.
Let's go to Margaret Hart in the back, then we'll come forward.
That was an excellent presentation, both of you. Thank you. Mark, what's it like to work on a series like this? Did you get to know Ken Burns? Do you sit at the table? Were you sitting at the table helping them with a script? I mean, are you helping when the filming comes along? Are you sitting there? Now, this is what we should put up in the Miller Center. I mean, how did you personally interact with this?
Yeah, it was a privilege, first of all, to be invited to participate, and I say that on behalf of Ken as well. Sarah Botstein called in late August 2011, about 6 years ago from now, and said, look, we're going to do this film. We hear that you at the Miller Center are the go-to folks for the White House tapes. We'd like to work with you if you'd like to work with us. And I said, you bet. At that point, we had published a fair amount of Johnson material on the war, but we had a whole lot more kind of waiting in the hopper in draft form. And so while we gave the Burns Novick team access to what we published, we also gave them access to what was unpublished, the draft material, from which they would select the audio that they wanted to use in the film. So there are moments in the film where you're going to see a handful of words on the screen. And sometimes they're there for dramatic effect. Sometimes the words are there because what's being spoken is tough to decipher. But for the most part, it's just the straight audio. So we gave them these transcripts, and they selected the snippets that they wanted to use for their purposes to slot them in to the narrative that they wanted to tell. I would say that after it was all over and the film was finished, essentially, they had invited Ken and I to New York, to WNET, the flagship station in New York, to attend what's called a post-lock screening. So the film's essentially put to bed. And the mix is not exactly right, and there you see some frame numbers maybe on top of the film, but essentially that's it. And we watched the whole thing in 4 days, 18 hours in 4 days. So sometimes it was 2 episodes a day, sometimes it was 3 episodes a day. And not only did we have an opportunity to engage with Ken and Lynn, and since then I've had more opportunities to engage with them, and particularly with Lynn, and it's really, it's a great privilege to have had that opportunity. But Tim O'Brien was at the screening, Carl Marlantis was at the screening, Merrill McPeak, who was Air Force Chief of Staff during the Clinton administration, and who was conducting those bombing runs, a mother and daughter who appear in the film, whose story is stretched through the entire thing. And that's really, in many ways, I mean, there are, I guess, a bunch of narrative hearts of the story, but theirs is certainly a killer. They were there, so we got to experience the trauma that they went through with them in attendance, and a host of others were there as well who appear in the film. And it was just an amazing 4 days. I did have a chance then to send Ken and Lynn my thoughts on what we'd seen, and suggestions for nuance and shading, and maybe 1 or 2 statistics that were different than the ones I had seen. So they invited our participation. There were other historians who had played a more central role, I would say, people that some of us know here and who've been here, Fred Logval. Or Greg Daddis, who I'm not sure Greg has been here, but people who have done a lot of work on Vietnam. And they had a chance, Ed Miller, who was one of the key historians at Dartmouth, had a chance to read through a bunch of scripts and to provide, I think, more real-time support in the narrative that Jeff Ward, who had written a bunch of other scripts for Ken and Lynn, wrote for this one as well.
And Margaret, I'll tell you just from my own experience with documentary film work, that's actually sort of an unusual thing, what you were describing of, I mean, typically on a project like this, lots of interviews with scholars, input from them, the people who are maybe going to be seen in the film, and there really are not scholars in this series. There are very, very few voices other than the people who actually are part of the events. But typically a filmmaker actually doesn't want at the end to show the whole thing to the people who've been involved for the very reason that there's a kind of creative control, but also unless there's something you really are just trying to make sure is right, you kind of don't necessarily want these other voices coming in and trying to relitigate conclusions that the film has already reached.
Right.
And so that's a very
It's courageous.
it's a courageous thing to do because Marc Selverstone might come out of that screening and write a letter to the New York Times that says this thing is a disaster, and so it's a brave thing for a filmmaker to do and somewhat unusual.
And
Thank you.
Let's go to the gentleman here, just a few rows up from the back. Yeah, right there. Raise your hand. There we go. Yep. Thank you.
Yes, this is more of a comment. I'm a former Marine sergeant, did 2 tours in Vietnam, and one of the points that you ended on was it a moral war or not? That's a very interesting intellectual exercise, but for us who fought there, most of the time we were honorable. It was a dishonor to fight for your country, and it was an honor to burn the flag. Yes, you do visit the dark side in war, and you do it so those at home don't have to go to spaces like that. But you also experience the ultimate altruism of wanting to give your life for your brethren. That's why all military people never leave the wounded or the dead, because the dead they belong home. And it's our duty, which is piousness, fidelity, to bring those people back home so they can be mourned.
Well, and I think that's a very important observation, and important that the film captures that. And in fact, I'll also say that one of the things we didn't get into much in this conversation, but certainly could have, is that where there are, I certainly would argue that as an observer, that from a sort of policy perspective, it would seem that there are lessons from Vietnam that have been lost in current times. But thank God we did learn a lesson from the way that veterans were treated after Vietnam in so many cases, that as we went into this new era of war, as a country, we had somehow very much so arrived at a very different consensus about that. And the way that we, even around highly disputed conflicts, there has not been this tendency to demonize the soldiers who were there doing their duty and as good, loyal Americans who we owe so much to. And that's a hugely important thing. So I completely agree.
It's a hugely important theme in the film. I would say that it's not really much of a spoiler alert, but one of the opening scene of the film is of the coming home experience and the difficulties that people had in grappling with that. People who were bystanders, who were citizens, people who were participants, that it just either wasn't something we wanted to talk about, or if we were talking about it, we talked about it in precisely these kinds of noxious ways.
Why don't we go to the back, and then we'll come to Fred Hitz in the middle. Yeah.
Thank you. The first time I saw the Vietnamese Wall Memorial in D.C., it was very difficult, very emotional. And you ended up saying at the end of this discussion that the film does not end with a precise conclusion. But I do want to know if you walked away feeling like it was an opportunity for healing for a lot of us in this room and a lot of people around both sides and both countries that live through this.
I believe that it was and will be. And I'll just relate one story, and you'll get a chance to see it. And I would recommend viewing the film as it airs. I think it's really powerful to see it as the filmmakers are intended to be seen, which is on 5 consecutive nights in 2 tranches weekly, so that you can follow those stories. But one of the voices that we hear is that of Bob Sorley, Louis Sorley, the historian whose books have been significant and have had an impact on the way a lot of people thought about the war. He's somebody who feels and writes that the war could have been won. In fact, that the war actually was won in 1971. Bob's very strong beliefs come through in the film, and he indicates that he had some real problems with the wall at first, as many people had problems with the wall, and you will see that in the film. That comes through loud and clear. But that after his initial reluctance to go there, he has repeatedly, and I think that that wall has done what myelin had intended it to do, is to provide that opportunity for healing. That's at least my takeaway from his experience. And so I think those two things together get at what you were hoping for, and I think the film achieves it.
It's also striking, I think, just to observe at this moment that what you've just said about the Vietnam Memorial and a great piece of stone, many pieces of stone that memorialized the dead from a conflict that there was so much dispute around. It is a demonstration of how important it is that conflicts be memorialized in ways that can last for eternity and that can survive the disputes. And it's just interesting to note that in the midst of a great turmoil about how we memorialize not just the dead, but the conflicts themselves and how complicated that is.
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges with the memorial. It is quite explicitly memorializing the dead, and what about the living and those who fought, and there are other challenges to address that.
These are complicated things.
To address
Yeah,
that.
very complicated things, whether we're talking about the Civil War or Vietnam or any other. But let's go to Fred Hitz right here in the middle. And then we've been all on this side. I promise we'll switch over to the other side.
For my pleasures this summer, I read both of the biographies of Richard Nixon. And you haven't mentioned his role in this, Mark. It was fascinating to see, with respect to the election between Humphrey and Nixon, that Nixon was getting information, largely through the Chenault, perhaps, key, that they could put pressure on Saigon to hang in there because they'd get a better deal when Nixon arrived. Did you find it? Is that, for one thing, is that subject taken up in the series?
Yeah,
and what was your sort of conclusion? Was Chenault the figure that she appeared to be?
Yeah, by all accounts, yes. And Richard Nixon was the figure that he
and that's a
appeared to
large
be.
part of one installment, isn't it? I mean, there's one installment of the series that very significantly deals with Chenault affair.
It's front and center in many ways. And again, I think that's a tribute to the work that Ken Hughes did on that episode. So episode, not episode of the film, but that historical episode. So yeah, you'll absolutely get that.
And the business of playing politics, to the extent that they did, was pretty hairy when you think of American lives that were involved.
Yeah, and also Fred, the decent interval as well. I mean, not just as Nixon is becoming president, but as he's seeking to be reelected. The decent interval is another, I don't even know how to describe it, unfortunate development in the war.
But something that our current president and our last president both, I think, have been confronted with the contemplation of. What is the way to finally withdraw from a thicket in a way that pride and honor can be preserved in the people you supposedly were backing.
And that's one of the, so as we continue to talk about these things, how do you withdraw from a really unsatisfactory conflict that's experienced that way by all sides? And as some will say in the film, look, that was essentially his only option. There were no good options. Now, should he have gone to Congress and been more forthright in what was happening? Should the back end of that not have been filled with so many recriminations that he himself stoked? Would the country have healed a little bit better, or at least not experienced the kind of divisions that we continue to over who's a patriot? What's the appropriate stance for criticizing one's government that has kind of lingered? And you think about it in the 2004 election, the swift voting of John Kerry, and all those things came back. But yes, those moments are there in high relief.
Why don't we go up to the edge over there, and we'll work our way back through. In fact, why don't you ask your question, and then let's pick up another question and have you deal with two at a time, because still lots of hands are still coming up.
I'd like to take the opportunity to ask you, from your unique perspective of having listened to hours and hours, days of tapes, whether you believe, as some surviving policymakers, not many of them these days, whether there's been a hint in the press lately, maybe from Gelb and others, that they were worried that Johnson, toward the end of his time in the White House, was borderline unhinged. And that's a sort of frightening thing. I mean, people say it lightly, but apparently that has been, suggested in a serious way. Having listened to him on a daily basis, what's your reaction to that suggestion?
I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. I saw my colleague Ian McKee had just left the room, and we're now involved in a LBJ 1968 tapes project, and I'm still in May of that year, so I'm getting there myself. But I will tell you that even if you go back to 1966 and the Fulbright hearings, Johnson thinks, and beyond the Fulbright here, Johnson thinks that all this anti-war opposition is being stoked by the communists. This is Beijing and Moscow is behind this, and we got to get to the bottom of who's running these guys. Every time that Bill Fulbright comes to see me, I know that he's gone to talk to Dobrynin at the Soviet embassy before that, and Johnson is seeing.
Are you not supposed to talk to the Russian ambassador?
Maybe not so openly.
I didn't know that. That's news to me. That's news.
So, I mean, you could argue that Johnson's fears were likely magnified by the end of 1968, and he was bitter by that time. And the film gives that to you, that sense of bitterness that Johnson had, and the brokenness that was Lyndon Johnson at the time. But you could argue that Johnson, these elements of him being unhinged or unmoored, they're there earlier as well. Yeah.
All right, let's get this gentleman here, and then let's also get Charlie on the edge. But first, let's hear from right here, and let's get two questions. Then you do.
Hi, I was on a college campus in 1970, and pretty much everyone I knew was anti-war, and I didn't think the war was such a good idea. But I ended up enlisting in the Navy, and why I did that, I mean, not that there were a lot of reasons, but why I even thought about it was because there was a draft, and you haven't really talked about the draft and the effect of the draft. Everyone, when I went to boot camp, most of the guys had enlisted because of the draft. I had a student deferment, which meant I wasn't going to be drafted, but and I didn't go to Vietnam. I never got anywhere near Vietnam, but what I have always felt since then is I feel that getting rid of the draft was, while a very good political move, it dramatically cut down on student anti-war demonstrations and everything else. But today, we don't have skin in the game. Our legislators don't have skin in the game. Our parents don't have skin in the game. And we get into these things because we think the military is perfect, and it is a blunt instrument that is not best for all situations. And I just wonder if there's any discussion about the draft and how that today would affect us if we had something like that.
I think
Hold that thought. Let's get a question from Charlie there. Okay. So actually, go back a couple rows right there. Yeah, Charlie.
What I wanted to ask about was the same sort of thing you were, but is the naval interest in the Vietnam War. I had a good friend of the family, a fellow who was an admiral, and he was in charge of a bombing squadron 8, in the Battle of Midway in World War II. And they smashed the Japanese Navy in the first real battle that they won, and after the war began. In the Vietnamese War, Admiral Carmody, he was an admiral by that time, and I think he was up on the Kitty Hawk, up and down the river. And he found out that he could get no help from the White House whatsoever So what he did, he was told he had to call and get their approval for any motion they did at all. So what he did, he'd wait until about 1 o'clock in the morning, Washington time, when they were all going to bed. And then he would tell them what he was going to do, and if he didn't hear him back within an hour, then he'd go ahead and fire against the enemy. And he did a great deal to save lives by doing that. Is there anything in the story about the Navy?
You know, there's not a whole lot about the Navy other than, the Navy fighter pilots, which is, such a big part of that story. But you don't get a whole lot about the brown water Navy. It's just not, it's not a significant part of the film, although it's there, like virtually all elements of the Vietnam story. They're at least addressed, touched upon, but not developed to any great extent. I would say, though, that what you're referencing in many ways is the conversation that we often have about LBJ micromanaging the war and picking targets from the White House. And that's the case with North Vietnam. But remember, far and away, the greatest amount of bombing was taking place in South Vietnam. And there was no discretion. I mean, they had free rein to unload on South Vietnam. So yes, whereas that's an important part of the story, should you hit Hanoi, should you mine Haiphong, should you go up to the Chinese border, it is something that people will continue to talk about, as people should continue to talk about that.
And then also address the question around the draft
The draft, it pervades the film, I would say. It's there throughout, all the choices that people had to make, and the impact it had on college campuses. When the lottery system was instituted, how that affected people. There's not much on the flip in '73 to AVF, and in fact, in one of the things that I wish they do a really nice job of highlighting kind of post-war developments in Vietnam and some of the engagement between Americans and Vietnamese after the war, leading toward normalization into what's going on in Vietnam today. But given some of the stories that were told of people who had gone to Canada or people who had burned their draft cards or people who decided to go, there's not much on amnesty. And amnesty, I think, was an important story, certainly in 1976, 1977, but then carried through. I think it's an important story. And that's one that I hope we have an opportunity to continue to talk about when people gather to talk about these
that
things.
skin in the game issue is where there's more discussion today about actually somebody who sat at this table not that long ago, the founder of Blackwater, who's now been in discussions with the White House about a completely private military force in Afghanistan.
Right.
And so when you get down to private contractor soldiers, you talk about distance from skin in the game. That is a very far distance. Well, let's go right there next to you, but let's ask your question, and then let's go back to the corner, and we'll do another twofer. See if we can squeeze in just a few more.
Stick around.
Considering the amount of fatally faulty thinking that put the war together in the first place, what do the filmmakers think is going to be the reaction for people who haven't been paying a whole lot of attention, and they sort of tabled it back there, and finding out that a lot of people died from all the way from the top all the way to the bottom, and that the stories that we were told were fictional?
Actually, go ahead. You take that, and then we'll go to the gentleman back. But go ahead.
I think that they're hoping to encourage, in some way, greater citizen engagement and activism, and they would like people to pay attention a little bit more. So Lynn and Ken are working on this piece that's going to appear in the Atlantic. It's an extended, I don't know how many words it is, but it's a long piece, and it's actually centered around a bunch of White House tape clips. So I've been working with them to help develop it a little bit and make sure that we can get appropriate links. But that's really where it goes, is look at the disparity, I think, as I said in the taping, between the public optimism and the private pessimism. Now you can really see that. And we couldn't see it before. I think so much of the Vietnam story, whether you're looking at the White House or whether even you're thinking about what was happening with the military as well, and the lies that were told from one branch to another that didn't make it back to LBJ, whether it was order of battle stuff or whatnot, or the metrics that were used on the ground to try to get a sense of how well the war was going. I think what it points to is not cynicism and pessimism, but toward greater engagement. I know that that's what they're hoping, and I am hoping that that's where the conversation goes.
Christopher, the gentleman in the blue.
I'm sure it wasn't really the objective of the film, but does it get into why we didn't win and what we could have done differently, if anything, to win, which of course is pretty relevant now as we continue to grapple with Afghanistan, among other things.
Yeah.
And your point of view on that as well, frankly.
Yeah, I think there is a subtext to the film which suggests that winning, and would have to define what winning would have looked like, would have been awfully hard to achieve, as I think we're finding in Afghanistan today. And you look at even the columns that have come out today and yesterday, they're so eerily familiar. They don't address it head on. At one point, Bob sorely does indicate, and he's written on Creighton Abrams, so he knows from whence he speaks. There are a lot of people who think that had Creighton Abrams become head of MACV a little bit earlier, there might have been a better opportunity to have prevailed. Again, what does that mean? To have held on to more enclaves in the South, to have fully prevented the NVA from moving into South Vietnam. It's not addressed probably in the way that you would like it addressed. And so, again, as I indicated before, it's not something that they're trying to explore. My own personal opinion is that I don't think that the objectives that the government laid out for itself were achievable in the way that they sought to achieve it. I just see too much getting in the way of that, and not just in the latter stages of the war, but earlier on as well. It's something I continue to wrestle with, quite honestly. I mean, I have to say that, because every time I read something new, I want to consider it from whatever side it's on, and wonder about, for instance, what was happening in the 1950s with rural affairs and the civic action programs, and the idealism that people like Rufus Phillips carried into the field when they were trying to help the rural South Vietnamese. I do find something noble in that and altruistic in that, and yes, very American in the 1950s and early 1960s about that. But at the same time, elements of that project were mismanaged from top to bottom. And so even the best of intentions, I think, had limited opportunities to be realized as fully as all liked, and then all would have liked. But by the time that you get to late Kennedy and then LBJ, and there are real questions about the legitimacy of the South Vietnamese government. You have 8 different governments within 18 months, something like that, or less. It's tough to really believe that house of cards is going to be able to stand. And then when you see, in the middle of 1966, riots in the streets in Da Nang, the Buddhists rising up once again, and large numbers of ARVN having to go to Da Nang to pacify the city from its own people on the one side, while they're fighting against the NVA and the Viet Cong on the other, that's not a strong ally. It's not a recipe for success. So my sense is that the venture was not going to turn out well.
And there's an argument to be made that pacification in a fully inflamed war environment, particularly a civil war, is really only possible with complete devastation, like Germany. That pacification is possible only if you destroy effectively every single thing and then reboot from the very beginning. I think there's an argument that that's the case.
And that the means that were used to achieve population security ended up undermining it. All over the place.
Let's take a question here from the lady. A second back. While we're getting over there, here's a question that came in from a Facebook Live viewer. How much did government deception break trust between the American people and the government, and have we recovered from that break?
Well, we continue to get document dumps, right, that tell us a little bit more than we knew before about what was going on. And I'm thinking originally of the Pentagon Papers here, but that deception, I think, first became apparent to the public in 1965, and not in the wake of Vietnam per se, but in the wake of the dispatch of 20,000, 25,000 Marines to the Dominican Republic. And Johnson's falsehoods, obfuscations that he told about why American troops were sent there. It became apparent that Johnson was not being straight with the American public. Bill Fulbright made a whole lot of this in his speech in September of 1965. And the term the credibility gap was born. And then it was imposed upon what was happening in Vietnam. And particularly by late 1967, when Johnson launches what has been called the Progress Campaign or the Progress Offensive. The war is going well, there's light at the end of the tunnel, Westmoreland comes back, Ellsworth Bunker comes back. The war is really going a whole lot better than you people think it's going. And we're moving into a place where the end has come into view, or almost some words to that effect. And then boom, the Tet Offensive takes place. And so more and more people are wondering, what's going on here? You're not being straight with us. And if the war is going so well and Tet was such a great victory for American forces, as it was in a military sense, why do you need 200,000 more troops that you're asking for in March of '68? So there is this sense at the time of a real credibility gap. 3 years later, when the Pentagon Papers hit the New York Times, and you can see that all of these presidents had serious doubts about the war, and they were not coming clean with the American public. I think that gap opens to kind of widening proportions. The Church Committee hearings in '75, Pike hearings in '76, I think it launched us into this period of real cynicism and questions about the propriety of using force abroad, which is, I think, a large part of 1970s American foreign policy.
And arguably, fake news is an extension of all that.
I know it's a long-winded answer. Yeah. Is it worse now than it was? It's a great question. On the one hand, there is more transparency that we have access to than we had at the time, and I think that that's helpful. The question is that transparency breeding that cynicism or optimism or constructive engagement? I don't have a great answer to that.
Yes, you can hear me. I used to fly for Pan Am, and I started in 1970. And I took a group of soldiers out of Saigon. That was the only experience I had directly with Saigon and the rest. But I talked to somebody on that plane who was brass, part of brass, and I asked him, what part does plutonium play in this war? And he said, no comment. Now, it seems to me that every war always has some kind of national interest involving, i.e., oil or something, getting us out of a hole and maybe getting into World War II, and full employment and all the rest. So there's always a political aspect to it. Is there any, that always made me curious, about that particular aspect of that war.
I would say, were economic motives driving this in any way? And I would say Yes, but not always. And so here, I think it's worthwhile to differentiate between what led the United States initially to commit to Vietnam in the latter part of the 1940s and early 1950s, and then what sustained that commitment over time. I think the economic motive diminished significantly over time. There were other forces, concerns that were much more important, such as international credibility. And we can talk about that, but I would say that in the in the late 1940s, when there was a real concern about making sure that Japan was kind of tied into the Western capitalist framework that seemed to be at odds with an emerging state-centered, Soviet-led communist framework, that making sure that those markets in Southeast Asia, as well as in Asia, and you think of it, the whole coast of East Asia was in ferment throughout those years, making sure that Japan had those markets was significant, and you see that in the documents, actually, 1948, 1950. I think by the time that you get to 1950 and you have the Korean War, it's still there, but there are broader strategic and credibility concerns, geopolitical concerns as well, regarding France's role as our ally on mainland Europe. But as you move toward what we know as the Vietnam War, the Second Vietnam War for us, I don't think those motives matter as much as they did earlier.
I think we probably should cut this off. This has really been fascinating, but thank you so much, Mark. That was great.